One of the greatest mistakes people make when they study avoidant behavior is assuming the avoidant fears love itself. That is not the full truth. What the avoidant truly fears is being fully seen. Because love, real love, has a way of exposing the parts of us we spend years hiding, the insecurities, the contradictions, the emotional wounds, the fear of inadequacy. And that is exactly why the connection with a super empath becomes so psychologically overwhelming for an avoidant person. A super empath is not simply nice. They are emotionally perceptive. They notice patterns. They hear what is not being said. They feel emotional shifts before words are spoken. They can often recognize pain behind arrogance, fear behind distance, and loneliness behind emotional withdrawal. In the beginning, this feels comforting to the avoidant. For perhaps the first time in their life, they feel understood without needing to explain themselves. And that creates emotional safety. But here is where the paradox begins. The deeper the connection grows, the more dangerous it feels to the avoidant psyche. Because when someone truly sees you, they also become capable of reaching the places you cannot hide from anymore. The avoidant may say they want closeness, commitment, intimacy, but internally, closeness threatens the emotional defenses they built for survival. Many avoidants learned early in life that vulnerability leads to pain, disappointment, rejection, or loss of control. So they mastered emotional distance as a protection mechanism. Then the super empath enters their life and unintentionally disrupts the entire system. The empath does not connect to the performance. They connect to the person underneath it. And that level of emotional exposure creates internal conflict inside the avoidant. Part of them craves it deeply. Another part of them feels trapped by it. That is why avoidants often pull away right after moments of genuine intimacy. It is not always because they stopped caring. Sometimes they care so deeply that it terrifies them. Now here is the brutal reality most people do not understand. After betraying a super empath, the avoidant often cannot emotionally recover in the same way ordinary breakups allow people to recover. Why? Because they did not simply lose a relationship. They lost someone who witnessed their authentic self and still chose to love the psychologically. That creates a very different kind of loss. You can replace attention. You can replace attraction. You can replace excitement. But it is incredibly difficult to replace genuine emotional recognition. And deep down, the avoidant knows this. They may distract themselves. They may enter new relationships quickly. They may convince themselves they made the right decision. But eventually silence catches up with everyone. And when the external noise disappears, they are left facing a painful truth. The person they pushed away was one of the few people who actually understood them beyond their defenses. That realization becomes psychologically haunting. Because once you experience unconditional emotional understanding, superficial connections begin to feel empty. Conversations feel shallow. Attention feels transactional. Validation feels temporary. The avoidant may continue searching for relief externally, but internally they are comparing every new connection to the depth they once had with the empath. And the tragedy is this: many avoidants do not recognize the value of that connection until after they destroy it. Not because they are evil, not because they're incapable of love, but because fear is powerful enough to make human beings sabotage the very thing they need most. That is why betrayal leaves such a permanent psychological imprint. The avoidant cannot escape the memory of being truly seen. Because the super empath reflected back a version of themselves they secretly wanted to become emotionally open, accepted, understood, and safe. And once that mirror is broken, they often spend years trying to find it again in other people, without realizing the real battle was never with the relationship. It was with themselves. Some losses do not hurt because of who we lost, they hurt because of who we became when we lost them. One of the most misunderstood dynamics in human psychology is the difference between escaping consequences and escaping yourself. Avoidant individuals become highly skilled at creating distance from emotional discomfort. They know how to shut down conversations, detach from conflict, disappear into work, distractions, new relationships, or emotional numbness. From the outside, it can appear as though they move on effortlessly. But emotional avoidance is not emotional freedom. Suppression is not healing. This is where betrayal creates a psychological fracture inside the avoidant mind. When an avoidant betrays someone, especially a super empath who offered trust, patience, and emotional safety, they may initially feel relief instead of pain. Relief from vulnerability, relief from accountability, relief from the intensity of intimacy. To many people, that reaction seems cold or heartless, but psychologically, it is often a defense mechanism. The avoidant nervous system interprets emotional closeness as pressure, obligation, or loss of control. So when they sabotage the relationship or betray trust, part of them feels temporary escape. But temporary escape is never the same thing as inner peace, because guilt has a unique psychological characteristic. It survives distance. You can block a phone number. You can avoid conversations. You can leave a relationship. But the mind still remembers what the conscience cannot resolve. This is important to understand. Human beings are not divided only by actions, they are divided internally by identity. Every person wants to believe they are fundamentally good, honest, worthy, and morally justified. Betrayal threatens that self-image. The remedy for avoidance, this creates enormous internal tension because they often lack the emotional tools required to process shame in a healthy way. Instead of confronting guilt directly, they bury it, they intellectualize it, they rationalize it, they minimize it, or they project blame outward. It was becoming too much. I needed space. They were too emotional, but I had no choice. But deep down, unresolved guilt does not disappear simply because it has been explained away logically. The subconscious mind keeps score. The body keeps score. Emotional memory keeps score. And this is why many avoidants become emotionally restless after betrayal. Not always visibly.
Not always immediately.
But internally, there is often an unspoken conflict between the person they presented themselves to be and the pain they know they caused. The super empath intensifies this conflict because empaths rarely love superficially. They invest emotionally. They believe deeply. They forgive repeatedly. So when the avoidant betrays that kind of trust, the guilt becomes heavier because somewhere inside, they recognize the imbalance. They know they wounded someone who genuinely cared for them. And here is where the psychology becomes even deeper. Avoidants do not merely avoid other people, they avoid emotional reflection, because reflection forces confrontation. It forces them to ask difficult questions. Why did I sabotage safety? Why did intimacy feel threatening? Why did I hurt someone who loved me? Those are not easy questions, especially for someone conditioned to disconnect from emotional pain rather than sit inside it. So instead of processing guilt, they often seek stimulation to outrun it. New attention, new validation, new environments, constant distraction. But unresolved guilt follows silently into every new chapter because betrayal changes the internal relationship a person has with themselves. Even if nobody else sees it, the avoidant often begins losing trust in their own emotional stability. They become more disconnected, more emotionally fragmented, more uncertain of their own capacity for intimacy. The betrayal they inflicted outward eventually becomes internalized inward. This is why many avoidants appear emotionally distant after hurting someone. It is not always because they feel nothing. Sometimes it is because feeling everything at once would force them to confront the truth they spent their lives avoiding. And the truth is simple. A person can escape a relationship. They can escape confrontation. They can even escape accountability for a period of time. But nobody escapes their own conscience forever. Eventually, silence becomes a mirror. And in that mirror, every unresolved action waits patiently to be acknowledged. Because the hardest person to forgive is often the person staring back at you. One of the rarest experiences in human life is not success, attraction, or even passion. It is emotional acceptance. To be loved not for performance, perfection, status, or convenience, but for your humanity, including your flaws, fears, and contradictions. And this is exactly what makes the connection between a super empath and an avoidant so psychologically powerful. The super empath does not love in shallow fragments. They love through understanding. They see emotional wounds and respond with patience. They encounter distance and often answer with compassion instead of punishment. While most people pull away from emotionally unavailable behavior, the empath frequently tries to understand the pain beneath it. That kind of emotion, generosity, is extremely rare in modern relationships. And for the avoidant, it can feel both healing and deeply uncomfortable at the same time. Because many avoidants are accustomed to conditional dynamics. They learned early that love must be earned, controlled, managed, or emotionally negotiated. Vulnerability may have been ignored. Emotional needs may have been criticized. Dependence may have been associated with weakness. So over time, they built an identity around self-protection and emotional independence. Then they meet someone who offers acceptance without demanding perfection. At first, this feels almost unreal. The super empath listens without judgment. They forgive mistakes. They create emotional safety during moments of fear and withdrawal. They continue to see value in the avoidant even when the avoidant struggles to see value in themselves. And psychologically, that kind of love becomes profoundly disarming because it reaches beneath the defensive identity the avoidant spent years constructing. But here is the tragedy many people fail to recognize. People often do not understand the value of emotional safety until they lose it. The avoidant may initially miss the empath's patience for permanence. They begin assuming the relationship will always be there regardless of their inconsistency, emotional distance, or betrayal. This is one of the most dangerous illusions in human relationships, the belief that unconditional love has no limit. Because even the deepest empathy eventually reaches a threshold where self-respect must speak louder than emotional attachment. And when the super empath finally walks away, the avoidant experiences something psychologically unfamiliar: the absence of emotional refuge. Suddenly the reassurance disappears. The understanding disappears. The emotional patience disappears. And what remains is comparison. This is why many avoidants struggle profoundly after losing a super empath. Not because every future relationship fails objectively, but because emotionally, very few connections replicate that level of acceptance. Surface attraction can be found anywhere. Chemistry can happen quickly. Attention is abundant in the modern world, but genuine emotional sanctuary is rare. The avoidant begins encountering relationships where people are less patient with emotional withdrawal, less understanding of in combination with threat onset, less willing to tolerate unresolved wounds. And slowly the avoidant realizes something painful. The empath was not weak for loving deeply. They were emotionally mature enough to love beyond ego. That realization changes everything, because now the avoidant is forced to confront the emotional standard they lost. They remember the conversations where they were understood without needing perfect words. They remember being accepted during moments when they felt broken, confused, distant, or emotionally unavailable. And perhaps for the first time, they recognize how extraordinary that level of emotional presence truly was. This creates a form of grief that is difficult to explain outwardly. It is not merely grief over losing a partner. It is grief over losing emotional safety itself. And human beings are deeply affected by the environments where they once felt emotionally safe. Neuroscience even shows that emotionally secure relationships regulate stress, calm the nervous system, and create psychological stability. So when that bond is destroyed through betrayal, the avoidant often loses more than companionship. They lose one of the few spaces where their inner world felt accepted without performance. That absence echoes, because eventually distractions lose their power. New excitement fades. Temporary validation becomes repetitive. And in those quiet moments, memory returns. Not just memories of the person, but memories of how it felt to be loved without constantly defending yourself. That is what becomes irreplaceable. And perhaps that is one of the cruel truths about self-sabotage. Sometimes we only recognize the value of a safe heart after becoming the reason it closed. One of the greatest illusions the avoidant mind believes is that distance creates safety. If emotions become too intense, they retreat. If intimacy becomes too deep, they disconnect. If conflict appears, they create space. And for a moment, that strategy seems effective because distance does reduce immediate emotional pressure. Silence can feel calmer than confrontation. Isolation can feel easier than vulnerability. But there is a profound psychological difference between solitude and emotional isolation. Solitude can heal a person. Emotional isolation slowly disconnects a person from themselves. This is where the avoidant pattern becomes dangerous over time. B. Cause every time someone escapes emotional discomfort, instead of processing it, they reinforce the belief that closeness itself is the threat. The nervous system learns avoidance as survival. And eventually the person no longer runs only from relationships, they begin running from emotional intimacy in every form. The tragedy is that human beings are not designed to thrive emotionally in permanent disconnection. We are psychologically wired for attachment, understanding, emotional resonance, and shared meaning. Even the most independent individuals still require emotional connection to feel internally grounded. But avoidants often confuse emotional self-protection with emotional strength. And after betraying a super empath, this confusion becomes even more severe. Why? Because the empath represented one of the few relationships where emotional closeness was genuinely available. The avoidant may have felt overwhelmed by that depth, but it was still real intimacy, perhaps deeper than anything they had previously experienced. Once they sabotage or betray that connection, they often convince themselves that leaving will restore control and emotional peace. Instead, many discover AAR something unexpected. The distance removes the relationship, but it does not remove the emptiness. In fact, the emptiness often grows louder. At first, distractions can hide it. Work, entertainment, casual connections, social media validation, temporary excitement, all of it creates stimulation. But stimulation is not fulfillment. Eventually, the mind becomes exhausted from constant avoidance. And when silence arrives, the avoidant is left alone with the emotional reality they spent years escaping. This is why many avoidants experience a strange contradiction. They desperately crave connection while simultaneously fearing it. They feel lonely, yet withdraw from people who get too close. They want love, yet sabotage emotional safety when it finally appears. Internally, this creates fragmentation because the human need for intimacy never fully disappears. It only becomes buried beneath fear. And fear is expensive. Every time someone chooses emotional avoidance over emotional honesty, they sacrifice depth for temporary comfort. Over time, relationships become increasingly superficial because vulnerability feels dangerous. Conversations stay on the surface. Emotional walls become automatic. Authenticity becomes rare. But here is what most people do not realize. The avoidant eventually suffers from the very isolation they created. Not always outwardly. Some appear successful, social, charismatic, even confident. But internally, emotional numbness begins replacing genuine connection. And numbness is not peace. Numbness is often unresolved pain that has lost its language. This is why betrayal of a super empath leaves such a lasting imprint. The empath offered emotional depth, patience, and presence. They attempted to bridge the emotional distance the avoidant carried inside themselves. When that bridge is destroyed, the avoidant often returns to familiar patterns of withdrawal, but now with the added weight of regret, guilt, and comparison. And comparison becomes psychologically brutal. Because after experiencing real emotional intimacy, shallow interactions begin to feel empty. The avoidant may continue meeting people, talking, dating, socializing, yet internally feel disconnected from all of it. Not because nobody else has value, but because authentic emotional resonance cannot be mass-produced. The super empath represented emotional depth. Depth changes people forever. So the avoidant enters a painful cycle. Seeking connection while fearing vulnerability, wanting closeness while resisting exposure, longing for intimacy while protecting themselves from it at all costs. That internal contradiction slowly becomes emotional loneliness. And emotional loneliness is one of the heaviest experiences a human being can carry. Because it is possible to be surrounded by people while feeling profoundly unseen. In the end, avoidance does not protect the heart. It only delays the pain while quietly increasing the distance between a person and the life they truly wanted to experience. Because the walls we build to keep pain out eventually become the same walls that keep love from getting in. One of the most deceptive emotional experiences in life is the feeling of relief that comes immediately after escape. When an avoidant leaves a relationship, betrays trust, or emotionally detaches from someone who genuinely loved them, there is often a temporary sense of freedom. The pressure is gone. The emotional expectations disappear. The vulnerability that once felt overwhelming suddenly seems distant. And in that moment, the avoidant, may genuinely believe they solved the problem, but they did not solve the problem. They only removed the environment that exposed it. This is an important distinction because many people confuse the absence of discomfort with healing. They think if I feel relief after leaving, then leaving must have been the right decision. But psychologically, relief is not always evidence of growth. Sometimes relief is simply the nervous system escaping confrontation. Imagine someone carrying a heavy wound but refusing treatment because treatment itself is painful. Walking away from the doctor may create temporary comfort, but the wound remains untreated beneath the surface. That is often what happens in avoidant behavior. The relationship was not the true source of suffering. The unresolved emotional patterns inside the individual were. The super empath unintentionally activates those patterns because they create emotional closeness powerful enough to challenge avoidance itself. They ask for honesty, presence, emotional openness, consistency, not because they want control, but because intimacy requires participation. And for the avoidant, that level of emotional engagement can feel exau. A sting when they have spent years surviving through emotional self-protection. So eventually, many avoidants begin associating freedom with distance. If I leave, I'll finally feel calm. If I escape this relationship, I'll feel like myself again. That if I remove the emotional intensity, life will become easier. And at first it does. There is less accountability, less vulnerability, less emotional exposure. But then something unexpected begins to happen. The freedom starts feeling empty. Because human beings do not only need independence, they need meaning. They need connection. They need emotional resonance. And this is where the avoidant often encounters a painful realization. Peace achieved through emotional disconnection is fragile. It lacks depth. It lacks grounding. It lacks fulfillment. Temporary freedom cannot replace genuine intimacy. This is why many avoidants eventually experience emotional restlessness after leaving someone who deeply loved them. They may gain space externally while becoming increasingly disconnected internally. The excitement of escape fades, and what remains is the emotional reality they tried to outrun. And that reality often sounds like the is. Why do superficial connections feel unsatisfying now? Why does attention no longer fill the emptiness? Why do I miss the one relationship that challenged me emotionally? Because challenge and healing are often connected. The super empath did not merely offer comfort. They offered emotional expansion. They created opportunities for the avoidant to become more honest, vulnerable, emotionally available, and self-aware. But growth rarely feels comfortable in the moment. Growth threatens old identities. It exposes wounds. It forces emotional evolution. And many avoidants mistake that discomfort for incompatibility. So instead of leaning into growth, they retreat toward familiarity, emotional distance, independence, control, self-protection. But familiarity is not always health. Human beings often return to patterns that feel predictable even when those patterns slowly destroy their capacity for fulfillment. That is the tragedy of avoidance. The avoidant may think they are protecting their freedom while unknowingly imprisoning themselves inside emotional repetition. Different people, same patterns. Different relationships, same fears. Different environments, same unresolved with. Ounds. Because external change means very little without internal transformation. And eventually, the avoidant begins noticing something difficult to ignore. The relationships that require the least vulnerability also produce the least emotional depth. They may feel safer, but they do not feel meaningful. They do not create the same sense of emotional aliveness that existed with the empath. This realization can become psychologically devastating because now the avoidant understands what they lost. Not just a person, but a level of connection that cannot be recreated through distraction, independence, or surface-level attraction. And here is the deeper philosophical truth beneath all of this. Freedom without emotional honesty becomes emptiness. Because real freedom is not the ability to run from intimacy. Real freedom is the ability to experience intimacy without running from yourself. And the moment a person understands that, their entire relationship with love begins to change. At the center of every avoidant pattern lies a difficult truth that many people spend years trying to escape. Healing does not begin when the pain disappears. Healing begins when the person stops running, dreaming from the source of the pain within themselves. This is why so many avoidants struggle to fully recover after betraying a super empath. The relationship may end, the communication may stop, time may pass. But time alone does not transform emotional patterns. Time only reveals them more clearly. And eventually, the avoidant reaches a moment where distractions stop working the way they once did. The silence becomes louder, the loneliness becomes heavier. The emotional repetition becomes undeniable. And for perhaps the first time, they are forced to confront a question they spent most of their life avoiding. What if the problem was never intimacy itself? What if the problem was my fear of being vulnerable enough to sustain it? That realization can completely destabilize the avoidant identity because avoidance is not simply a behavior, it is often a survival strategy built over years of emotional conditioning. Many avoidants learned early that emotional dependence was dangerous. Vulnerability may have led to rejection, abandonment, criticism, or emotional neglect. So they adapted by becoming emotionally self-contained. On the surface, this adaptation can look like strength, but internally, it often creates emotional starvation. Because human beings are not designed to heal entirely alone. We are relational creatures. We grow through connection, reflection, emotional safety, and honest vulnerability. Yet the avoidant mind often interprets vulnerability as weakness because vulnerability requires surrendering control. And control feels safer than uncertainty. This is why betrayal becomes such a turning point psychologically. Betraying a super empath forces the avoidant into confrontation with themselves. Not immediately, perhaps, sometimes years later. But eventually the emotional consequences arrive. They begin recognizing patterns they once blamed on circumstances or other people. Every time intimacy deepened, they withdrew. Every time emotional exposure increased, they sabotaged. Every time love became real, fear took control. And eventually excuses stopped feeling convincing. This is the beginning of genuine self-awareness. Now here is where true recovery either begins or never happens at all. Because awareness alone is not transformation. A person can recognize their patterns and still remain trapped inside them. Real healing demands response, ability. It demands emotional honesty. It demands the willingness to sit inside discomfort without escaping into distractions, avoidance, or emotional shutdown. That is extraordinarily difficult for an avoidant because it requires dismantling the very defenses that once protected them. But there is no other path. You cannot heal intimacy while avoiding vulnerability. You cannot experience deep connection while resisting emotional openness. And you cannot build trust while refusing to confront your own fears. The avoidant who truly recovers is not the one who finds another relationship quickly. It is the one who finally becomes brave enough to examine themselves without defensiveness, to ask, why do I fear closeness? Why do I sabotage safety? Why does love trigger fear instead of peace? Those questions require courage because the answers often lead back to unresolved wounds the person spent years burying beneath independence and emotional control. But buried pain does not disappear. It shapes behavior silently until it is acknowledged consciously. And this is where the super empath leaves a permanent impact, not only because of the love they gave, but because of the mirror hate provided. The empath reflected back the avoidant's deepest emotional contradictions, their desire for connection alongside their fear of it, their longing for love alongside their instinct to escape it. Once that mirror exists, it becomes very difficult to pretend anymore. The avoidant eventually understands that every external escape still carried the same internal patterns. Different faces, different places, different experiences, but the same fear remained untouched beneath all of it. And that realization becomes the doorway to transformation. Because the moment a person stops blaming intimacy and starts confronting themselves, healing finally becomes possible. Painful, yes. Humbling, absolutely. But real. In the end, the avoidant cannot recover through distance alone. Recovery begins the moment they stop asking how to escape love and start asking how to become emotionally capable of receiving it. At the end of all this, the real tragedy is not simply that the avoidant lost the super empath. The deeper tragedy is that they were given a rare opportunity to experience authentic love. Emotional safety and genuine human connection and fear convinced them to run from I. That is what avoidance ultimately does. It does not destroy love because love was weak. It destroys love because vulnerability feels dangerous to an unhealed mind. And for a while, the avoidant may believe they escaped the problem. They may move forward, stay distracted, surround themselves with noise, attention, temporary excitement. But eventually life becomes quiet enough for truth to speak. And truth has a way of reaching every human being sooner or later. The truth is this: you cannot outrun yourself forever. The super empath represented more than affection. They represented emotional depth, understanding, patience, and acceptance. They offered a mirror that reflected not only who the avoidant was, but who they could have become if they had the courage to stop hiding behind fear. And that is why the loss lingers so deeply. Not because the empath was perfect, not because the relationship had no flaws, but because real emotional connection leaves fingerprints on the soul. The avoidant eventually realizes that what they were searching for externally was never missing in the relationship itself. What was missing was their own ability to remain emotionally present, not long enough to receive it fully. And this is a lesson that applies far beyond romantic relationships. Every human being faces the same choice at some point in life. Will you allow fear to control your relationships? Or will you become strong enough to face yourself honestly? Because healing is not found in escape. Peace is not found in emotional numbness. And freedom is not found in avoiding intimacy. Real freedom begins when a person no longer needs to run from vulnerability in order to feel safe. That is the paradox of human growth. The moment we stop protecting ourselves from love is often the moment we finally begin to heal.